May 6, 2025. The Oval Office. A Canadian economist sits across from the most powerful man on the planet, a man who had spent months threatening to erase Canada's economy. Who had slapped tariffs on Canadian goods? Who had publicly floated the idea of making Canada the 51st state of the United States? And then Carney opened his mouth.
As you know from real estate, there are some places that are never for sale.
It's not for sale. It won't be for sale ever. Trump smiled. Never say never.
Canada is stepping up the military participation because Mark knew, they were low and now they're stepping it up, and that's a very important thing. But never say never. Never say never.
Carney didn't blink. This is not a political opinion. This is the documented story of how a kid from a frozen town nobody has heard of became the economist who saved two economies from collapse, ran the world's oldest central bank, and ended up in that chair, in that room, saying those 8 words to that man. This is the rise of Mark Carney. To understand why that Oval Office moment landed the way it did, you have to understand what Trump was expecting when Carney walked in. Trump had spent months treating Canada as a dependent, a country that needed American goodwill more than America needed Canadian trade. He had called Canada a burden. He had threatened 25% tariffs across the board. He had repeatedly and publicly suggested that Canada's sovereignty was negotiable. The assumption behind it all was simple. Canada would absorb the pressure. Canada would accommodate. Canada would send someone to Washington who would find a way to soften the edges without saying anything that made the room uncomfortable. Instead, Canada sent Mark Carney. And Carney did not come to soften edges. He came having already spent months building alternative trade relationships on 4 continents. He came having already signed or negotiated partnerships with India, ASEAN nations, the European Union, Qatar, and China. He came having already committed to doubling Canada's defense spending by the end of the decade. He did not walk into that room empty-handed, hoping for mercy. He walked in having already started building a different future.
I'm pleased today to announce that Canada and China have reached a preliminary but landmark trade agreement to remove trade barriers and reduce tariffs.
Mark Joseph Carney was born on March 16, 1965, in Fort Smith, Northwest Territories, a small town, a small hospital, a place most Canadians have never visited. His father was a school principal. His mother returned to university when Carney was 10 to build her own career. This was not a family of inherited advantage. It was a family built on the straightforward belief that work produces results. When Carney was 6, the family relocated to Edmonton, Alberta, oil country, a place where winters are long and people are practical. He played hockey with the intensity that every Canadian kid plays hockey, and when the time came, he earned a partial scholarship to Harvard University. At Harvard, he was not simply a student. He was the backup goalie for the varsity ice hockey team, the last line of defense, the person whose entire job was to stand in front of the net and stop the worst from happening. He graduated in 1987 magna laude with a degree in economics. Then, Oxford, a master's degree in 1993, a doctorate in 1995. After Oxford came Goldman Sachs, 13 years inside one of the most powerful financial institutions on the planet. Tokyo, London, New York, Boston, Toronto. He served as co-head of sovereign risk, executive director for emerging markets debt, and managing director for investment banking. He worked on South Africa's post-apartheid entry into international bond markets. He was present during the 1998 Russian financial crisis, watching in real time what happens when an economy collapses and studying who pays the price. Most people who reach his level at Goldman Sachs leave for more money, more power, and more private sector luxury. In 2003, Carney left for public service. He joined the Bank of Canada as a deputy governor, a pay cut that people on Bay Street found genuinely baffling. Carney had been governor of the Bank of Canada for less than 2 months when Lehman Brothers collapsed, and the global financial system entered its most catastrophic failure since 1929. Banks were failing in the United States. European institutions were bleeding. The entire world was waiting to find out which economies would survive intact and which would not. Canada survived, not by luck, by decision. Carney cut interest rates by 50 basis points in March 2008, one of his first major acts as governor. At a moment when the European Central Bank was still raising rates, he saw the wave before most others did. Canada became the first G7 nation to fully recover both its GDP and its employment levels after the crisis. Not the second, not close, first. In November 2012, Britain came looking for someone to run the Bank of England. The Bank of England was established in 1694. It is the oldest and most prestigious central bank on Earth. And in 318 years of operation, it had never appointed a non-British citizen as its governor. Britain looked at every economist it had, every banker, every financial mind has been produced over 3 centuries, and it chose the Canadian from Fort Smith.
Mark Carney has been appointed as the next governor of the Bank of England. British Chancellor George Osborne made the announcement in Parliament.
He led the Bank of England through Brexit, one of the most economically disruptive political decisions any major democracy had made in decades. He navigated the early turbulence of a global pandemic. He guided Britain through 2 of the most volatile chapters in its modern political history. By January 2025, Canada's political situation had shifted entirely. Justin Trudeau had announced his resignation, ending nearly a decade as Prime Minister.
I intend to resign as party leader, as Prime Minister.
The Liberal Party needed a new leader. But more than that, Canada needed someone who understood not just domestic politics, but the brutal mechanics of global economic pressure. Because Donald Trump had returned to the White House, and his opening move was to aim his trade arsenal directly at Canada.
But look, what I'd like to see, Canada become our 51st state. We give them protection, military protection.
Carney entered the Liberal leadership race in January 2025. He won in a landslide that March. He was sworn in as Canada's 24th Prime Minister on March 14, 2025, becoming the first Prime Minister in Canadian history to take office without ever having previously held elected office.
I, Mark Carney, do swear that I will be faithful and bear true allegiance to His Majesty, King Charles III, King of Canada, his heirs and successors.
Within weeks, he dissolved Parliament and called a federal election. He led the Liberals to a 4th consecutive mandate since 2015, overturning opinion polls that had predicted a Conservative landslide just months earlier. Before the Oval Office came Davos, January 20th, 2026, the World Economic Forum in Switzerland. Every major world leader, every significant CEO, every central banker of consequence gathered to try to make sense of a world that felt like it was coming apart at its structural seams. Carney walked to the podium and delivered a speech that Newsweek, the BBC, Reuters, and The Guardian all described as one of the most significant addresses by any world leader in years. He told the assembled leaders of the world plainly that Canada had already taken its sign down. Canada was building strategic autonomy in energy, critical minerals, artificial intelligence, and defense. That Canada was not waiting for the old order to return. Nostalgia is not a strategy. Which brings everything back to May 6, 2025. The man sitting across from Trump was not a politician who had spent his life building toward that moment. He was an economist who had spent his life solving the hardest financial problems the modern world had produced, at the highest levels, under the most extreme pressure, and getting the answers right. When Trump said never say never, Carney did not reach for a diplomatic escape. He simply held the position. Former Conservative Prime Minister Stephen Harper, a man who spent a decade cultivating relationships with American administrations, stood before American lawmakers later that year and said, Canadians are a combination of just angry and bewildered by what is happening, and that it is very real and very deep and runs across the entire political spectrum. This is not a liberal story. This is not a conservative story. This is a story about a country that was told it was too small, too dependent, too reliant on one relationship to ever push back. And then it produced a prime minister from Fort Smith, Northwest Territories, who had spent 40 years learning exactly how power works, exactly where leverage lies, and exactly how to stand in front of the net when everything is coming at you at once. 8 words, delivered without flinching, heard around the world. It's not for sale. It won't be for sale ever. That is not a line from a speech. That is the output of a life's work, walking into a room and doing exactly what it was built to do. Mark Carney didn't come from politics. He came from the fire, and he was ready when Canada needed him most. If this story hit differently, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe for more breakdowns like this one.